Right after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States entered one of the most uncertain periods in its history. While the attack itself lasted only 90 minutes, the immediate aftermath proved far more chaotic. Damaged communication systems produced conflicting reports, and military commanders struggled to understand what had just happened or what might come next. When the last Japanese aircraft left Oahu's skies around 9:45 that morning, thick smoke still covered the island and moved across the water where battleships had capsized or were burning, creating a scene of destruction that would stay with witnesses for the rest of their lives. Communication systems across the base had been damaged or destroyed, which meant reports from different bases disagreed with each other. Military commanders received pieces of information that often made no sense when placed together. They were unable to form a clear picture of what had just happened or what might come next. Something in those first hours became the foundation for every action that followed, and understanding what happened during that time reveals how unprepared America truly was. Radar operators continued watching their screens, but many had trouble telling different types of aircraft apart, which turned every blip into a potential threat. Meanwhile, anti-aircraft guns kept firing long after the Japanese planes had left because crews believed they saw more aircraft approaching, their fear and adrenaline making shadows into enemies. Families living near the coast fled inland, convinced that Japanese soldiers would land on the beaches at any moment. Hospitals transformed themselves within hours, with lobbies becoming emergency wards as medical staff prepared for casualties they hoped wouldn't come. But even as Hawaii scrambled to defend itself against threats that might never come, the real challenge was just beginning. The question everyone faced was simple to state, but impossible to answer. What should they do next when they do not know if the worst is over or still to come? The last Japanese bomber left shortly after 9 in the morning on December 7, 1941, but anti-aircraft guns continued firing until midday because crews reported seeing more aircraft that might be hostile. In his book At Dawn We Slept, historian Gordon Prang noted that radar operators at Opana Station detected multiple unidentified flights after the attack, which were actually U.S. aircraft returning, but operators could not confirm this at the time. This situation put American forces at risk of accidentally firing on their own planes, adding another layer of danger to an already chaotic morning. The confusion stemmed from the problems with Hawaii's defense systems. Many of the radar stations were brand new and still considered training equipment by the soldiers assigned to operate them. The operators had limited experience, and procedures for checking contacts had broken down completely under the pressure of actual combat. Ground observers stationed at various points around the island tried to track aircraft by sight, but huge smoke clouds rising from burning ships blocked accurate observation. What should have been a simple task became something very difficult. According to Prang, anti-aircraft batteries fired at false targets until late morning because thick smoke blocked visibility. The haze drifted for miles and blocked visual identification, creating an atmosphere where every shadow became a potential enemy aircraft. Without clear information about what was happening in the skies above them, commanders on the ground had to make critical decisions with almost no reliable data. As Prang documented, commanders feared an invasion because Japanese aircraft carriers were still unlocated. Without knowing where the Japanese fleet had gone, military leaders prepared for the possibility that landing forces might arrive at any moment. They positioned troops and equipment based on guesswork rather than intelligence. This fear of invasion spread beyond the military bases to the civilian population. Panic spread quickly through neighborhoods near the coast as families who had watched the attack grabbed whatever possessions they could carry and drove inland. Roads became clogged with traffic, which interfered with military vehicles trying to move supplies and personnel to defensive positions. The complete traffic jam made an already difficult situation nearly impossible to manage. When conditions worsened, some families abandoned their cars on the roadside and continued on foot while carrying children and whatever belongings they could manage in a desperate attempt to reach safety. While civilians fled and soldiers tried to organize defenses, the medical emergency grew worse as the day continued. Hospitals throughout Honolulu converted lobbies and hallways into emergency treatment areas that soon ran out of basic supplies. Bandages, antiseptics, and morphine were consumed rapidly. Volunteer nurses who had rushed to help found themselves doing tasks far beyond their training because trained medical personnel were overwhelmed by the huge number of casualties. Students from local schools arrived asking what they could do. Many ended up helping transport patients or clean equipment under the guidance of exhausted doctors who were grateful for any assistance they could get. Blood supplies ran critically low within hours, prompting urgent calls for donors throughout Honolulu that brought hundreds of people to hospitals despite their own fear and uncertainty. Adding to these challenges, many telephone lines connecting different installations had been damaged or destroyed during the attack. Field commanders received delayed and incomplete reports that made coordination nearly impossible. Without reliable communication, efforts became duplicated in some areas, while other areas received no support at all, creating problems that cost precious time and resources as commanders struggled to make sense of the situation. Some commanders resorted to sending messengers by vehicle or motorcycle to deliver orders, but this method was slow and unreliable given the traffic conditions and damaged roads across the island, turning what should have taken minutes into journeys that lasted hours. Military commanders faced a difficult choice between beginning recovery operations or staying ready to defend, knowing that either decision could prove fatal if they guessed wrong. Section 2. Martial law and lockdown. As military leaders worked to restore some sense of order, the territorial government took extraordinary measures to maintain control. The territorial governor declared martial law under military authority shortly after the attack ended. Civilian courts stopped operating as military tribunals took their place to handle all legal matters. The army took control of utilities, which meant decisions about power, water, and other essential services now came from military commanders rather than civilian administrators. This shift in authority happened with remarkable speed and changed Hawaii's government structure within hours. In his book Day of Infamy, historian Walter Lord described how civilian neighborhoods were ordered to black out windows, extinguish lights, and limit outdoor movement within hours. The blackout orders that went into effect after dark changed Honolulu completely. Streets that had always been lit at night became corridors of complete darkness that felt strange and threatening to residents who had never experienced anything like it. Drivers who absolutely needed to use their vehicles at night were required to tape their headlights down to narrow slits that provided barely enough light to see the road. Many people simply stayed home after sunset because moving around in the darkness felt too dangerous and the risk of accidents seemed too high. The blackout was only one part of the new security measures sweeping across the island. Lord also noted that Honolulu police and army units set up roadblocks around key infrastructure to prevent potential sabotage and control movement across the island. Radio stations faced strict new rules about when they could broadcast and at what signal strength. Military authorities worried that Japanese forces could use radio signals for navigation, so stations were ordered to reduce their power or shut down entirely during certain hours. This left people trying to get information about what was happening with no reliable source of news, increasing the sense of isolation and fear that already gripped the island. Without accurate information, rumors spread quickly in the vacuum, with some claiming that Japanese forces had already landed on other Hawaiian islands, while others suggested that the entire Pacific Fleet had been destroyed, each story growing more dramatic with each retelling as fear-fueled imagination. The effect on morale was clear. Lord recorded that people standing in food lines described long silences broken only by sirens, showing how the shock of the attack had built an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that affected every aspect of daily life. Yet even as civilians struggled with fear and confusion, military operations continued around the clock. Despite the chaos, patrol aircraft from Kaneohe Naval Air Station attempted searches to locate the Japanese fleet. Fuel limits restricted how far they could fly and how long they could remain airborne. In his book, The Battle of Midway, naval historian Craig Simons documented that U.S. Navy PBY patrol planes attempted wide search arcs despite damaged fuel lines and limited fuel. Pilots took off knowing they might not find anything and that they would be vulnerable if they encountered enemy aircraft. They went anyway because finding the Japanese carriers was considered essential to preventing another attack. On the ground, emergency construction teams worked through the afternoon clearing runways that had been damaged by bomb craters. They used whatever equipment they could find to fill holes and remove debris so that aircraft could take off and land safely. Navy salvage teams began initial checks of sunken ships, even though some vessels were still burning and the water was covered with leaking fuel oil that created a constant fire hazard. At sea, the search for threats continued with equal intensity. Simons noted that destroyers began high-speed sweeps outside Pearl Harbor to locate submarines, many of which were false contacts. This reflected the heightened state of alert that had everyone seeing threats, whether they existed or not. He further observed that aircraft from surviving runways were armed and launched in emergency intercept patterns, even without confirmed targets, showing how commanders prepared for threats based more on fear than intelligence. As Hawaii worked through those first chaotic hours, the mainland was just beginning to understand what had occurred. Section 3. American Defense Mobilization. The time difference meant that most Americans heard about the attack during the afternoon on December 7, 1941. The initial reports were incomplete and often disagreed with each other. People across the country struggled to understand what had really happened. What they did grasp, however, was that the United States had suffered a significant defeat that would change everything. The response on the mainland was immediate and widespread. Army bases on the West Coast went to high alert within hours of receiving news about Pearl Harbor. Soldiers manned defensive positions and scanned the skies for enemy aircraft that might already be approaching. In his book, Tower of Skulls, historian Richard Frank documented that West Coast military bases triggered Condition 2 alerts, with aircraft loaded, fueled, and parked dispersed to avoid sabotage. Anti-aircraft batteries moved into place near major ports in Los Angeles, San Diego, and Seattle, while crews prepared to fire at any unidentified aircraft that appeared. Their fingers were tense on triggers as they waited for an attack that could come at any moment. The federal government grounded all civilian aircraft nationwide, which meant that commercial flights stopped operating and private pilots were prohibited from flying. Hollywood studios voluntarily dimmed or shut off their nighttime marquee lights to reduce visibility from the air. The sudden crisis overwhelmed communication systems across the country. The Associated Press received over 800 incoming queries per hour, far above normal levels. Newspapers and radio stations sought information about what had happened. Frank noted that phone lines connecting California and Hawaii were so overloaded that military telegrams had priority over civilian calls. Telephone operators reported that lines to Hawaii were jammed solid for much of December 7th and 8th, 1941. Many people were trying to call, but most connections could not go through. Families with relatives in Hawaii were unable to determine whether their loved ones were safe. This increased the anxiety and fear that gripped the nation. The United States simply did not yet know if more attacks were coming. This uncertainty drove military preparations across the country. Military commands throughout the nation attempted to check their readiness for more attacks, while also trying to gather information about what had happened at Pearl Harbor. West Coast commanders worried that Japanese carriers might strike San Francisco or Seattle next and began moving forces into defensive positions. Frank also recorded that supply depots in San Diego and San Francisco began issuing ammunition to Coast Guard and Army coastal units as they prepared for battles that might begin at any moment. The concern extended to critical infrastructure beyond the West Coast. Commands in the Panama Canal Zone increased security because the canal represented such a critical war asset. Its loss would severely impact America's ability to move ships between oceans. Atlantic Fleet commanders maintained their focus on German submarine threats, but also prepared for the possibility that they might need to send ships to the Pacific to replace losses at Pearl Harbor. Despite all this activity, information from Hawaii to Washington remained frustratingly slow and often inaccurate. Initial reports provided rough estimates of casualties and damage that changed constantly as more complete information arrived. Military officials in Washington received reports that disagreed with each other, with one message saying that a particular ship had been sunk, while another message claimed the same ship was still afloat, making it impossible to know what the real situation was as commanders tried to assess the true extent of the damage. Beyond the military response, civilian authorities faced their own challenges trying to maintain order. Local police departments in major cities increased patrols and prepared to enforce blackout rules that might be ordered at any time. Fire departments reviewed their procedures for responding to air raids and bomb damage. Civil defense organizations that had existed mostly on paper suddenly became relevant. Volunteers who had joined these organizations expecting never to do anything found themselves being called up for actual duty. The West Coast felt especially exposed because residents understood they were closer to a possible Japanese attack than people living elsewhere in the country. This sense of vulnerability affected daily life in coastal communities. People living near naval bases or aircraft factories worried that these facilities might become targets. Some chose to send their children to stay with relatives inland, where they might be safer from bombs or invasion. Schools discussed evacuation plans and prepared to close if attacks occurred. Businesses near war installations considered whether they should close temporarily or move their operations elsewhere to reduce their risk. Over the following weeks, the psychological impact of feeling exposed to attack built pressures that would eventually lead to controversial policies affecting thousands of innocent people whose only crime was their ancestry. Section 4. Washington's Emergency Response. As the West Coast prepared for possible attacks and the public grappled with fear and uncertainty, the center of government in Washington worked through the night to shape America's response. President Roosevelt received initial casualty estimates during the evening of December 7, 1941, but these numbers rose steadily through the night as more accurate reports arrived from Hawaii. According to records from the Roosevelt Presidential Library, Roosevelt received the first accurate casualty summary close to midnight, listing more than 2,000 dead and massive fleet losses. The figures began at several hundred, then climbed to over 1,000. And continued rising as rescue teams discovered more victims in capsized ships and damaged buildings. Each new report made the scale of the disaster clearer and more terrible. Knowing that the nation would need to understand what had happened and what came next, he directed his speechwriter, Samuel Rosenman, and others to begin preparing draft statements that could be delivered to Congress. He knew that a declaration of war would almost certainly be necessary. The words he chose would shape how the nation understood this moment. In his book Combined Fleet Decoded, historian John Prados noted that the earliest draft of the Day of Infamy speech was only one sentence long, but Roosevelt personally rewrote it into the historic version. Roosevelt also instructed military commanders to make locating the Japanese fleet carriers their top priority. Preventing another attack required knowing where those carriers were positioned and what they might strike next. Congressional leaders were contacted by emergency messengers throughout the evening as word spread that the president would address a joint session the following day. Many representatives and senators had been away from Washington for the weekend and needed to return immediately. Some lawmakers were hundreds of miles away and had to arrange emergency transportation to get back to the Capitol. Prados documented that Congress members were escorted by police and military due to fears of sabotage in Washington. D.C. special cordons were established around the Capitol building to protect the government's ability to function. Committee chairs began drafting the language for a war declaration before dawn, knowing that time would be limited once the formal session began and that every word would matter in defining how America would respond to this crisis. While Congress prepared for its historic session, military command structures activated emergency protocols that had been prepared for this type of crisis but had never been tested under real conditions. Prados noted that the War Department evaluated the possibility of attacks on the Panama Canal and West Coast cities while trying to determine which locations faced the greatest risk. Naval Department officials requested immediate fleet readiness updates from both Atlantic and Pacific commands. They sought accurate information about which ships were available for operations and which were undergoing repairs or maintenance. The Army Air Forces ordered increased air patrol coverage over major industrial centers, particularly aircraft factories and shipyards that would be essential for wartime production. Across the federal government, different departments tried to work together on their responses, though the lack of established procedures for this level of crisis slowed coordination and created confusion about who had authority over what. The Federal Bureau of Investigation started watching individuals deemed potential security risks, particularly those with connections to Japan or Germany. This effort would eventually lead to controversial policies affecting Japanese Americans, though those decisions had not yet been made during the first night. The Treasury Department began planning for how to fund a major war effort through bond sales and tax increases. The State Department looked at the effects on diplomatic relations, particularly regarding whether Germany and Italy might declare war on the United States in support of their Japanese ally. Throughout all this activity, Roosevelt remained at the White House despite concerns for his safety. According to Roosevelt Presidential Library records, military advisors urged the president to relocate to a safer site, but Roosevelt flatly refused, believing it would signal panic. His determination to remain visible and in command helped establish a sense of steady government operations despite the crisis. These overnight actions laid the foundation for America's wartime transition. The question of how to present the situation to Congress and the American people occupied much of the president's attention. Roosevelt's inner circle debated the approach. Some advisors argued for emphasizing that the attack occurred while diplomatic negotiations were still underway. Others suggested focusing on the military necessity of responding to prevent further attacks and protect American interests. Roosevelt himself understood that the speech needed to unite the country while avoiding language that might seem overly dramatic. The phrase that would become famous appeared as Roosevelt refined his message throughout the night. December 7th would be described as a date that will live in infamy. Beyond the speech, military planners faced the practical challenge of determining how to continue the fight. They began figuring out how to wage war across the Pacific with a significantly damaged fleet. Repairing or replacing the battleships lost at Pearl Harbor would take months or years. Alternative strategies would be needed to continue fighting. Aircraft carriers became more important in planning than they had been previously. The fact that these ships had survived the attack provided some options for future operations. Plans for offensive operations against Japanese-held territory were postponed, while commanders focused on preventing more losses and securing American positions across the Pacific. At the same time, intelligence services worked to develop better information about Japanese capabilities and intentions. New procedures for sharing intelligence between services were discussed. Putting these procedures in place would require time and overcoming years of institutional separation that had created the missing pieces, allowing the attack to succeed. Prados documented that intelligence divisions attempted to re-establish broken communication lines with Honolulu, taking nearly 24 hours to stabilize the connections needed for reliable information flow. Analysts worked through the night trying to determine where the Japanese carriers might strike next. They used whatever incomplete information they could gather. Officials began to recognize that the organizational structure for gathering and analyzing information had serious problems that needed immediate attention. Alongside military planning, domestic security concerns competed for attention. Federal officials worried about potential sabotage attempts against critical infrastructure such as bridges, power plants, and communication facilities. Guards were posted at locations considered vulnerable. Military personnel helped local police forces in protecting important installations against threats both real and imagined. As dawn approached on December 8th, government officials had not slept, but had accomplished significant work. Draft legislation was ready for congressional consideration. Military orders had been issued to commands across the country and around the world. Preparations were underway for the president's address to Congress. The speed of this response showed that the American government retained the capacity to organize and act once the initial shock had passed. However, many questions went unanswered. No one knew where the Japanese fleet had gone after leaving Hawaiian waters or whether more attacks were about to happen. The full extent of damage at Pearl Harbor was still being checked. Casualty figures continued to rise as rescue teams worked through the wreckage. Most critically, no one could predict how long the war would last or what sacrifices it would require from the American people, and those changes would begin immediately. Section 5. America enters global war. While Hawaii struggled to recover and Washington worked through the night, the war that had begun at Pearl Harbor continued to expand. Japanese forces continued their offensive with attacks on multiple locations across the Pacific. The Philippines came under assault beginning December 8, 1941, Manila time, which was still December 7th in Hawaii due to the international dateline. British possessions in Malaya faced invasion. Guam and Wake Island came under attack. This expanding crisis meant that American military forces could not focus solely on recovering from Pearl Harbor. They also had to respond to new threats developing across a vast area. Resources were already stretched to the breaking point. Yet even amid this expanding crisis, as the first 24 hours drew to a close, some patterns had begun to appear from the chaos. The attack on Pearl Harbor proved significant, but not completely crippling. Perhaps most importantly, American aircraft carriers had been at sea during the attack and were undamaged. This meant the Pacific Fleet still possessed important striking power. Repair efforts were underway on damaged ships. Some vessels that had seemed beyond saving might actually be returned to service. This offered hope that the situation was not as dire as it first appeared. But while Hawaii and the West Coast dealt with immediate threats, Washington was already laying the groundwork for a longer struggle. The War Production Board was in early formation stages even before the formal declaration of war. Officials identified which industries would need to convert from civilian to military manufacturing. They determined how quickly those conversions could happen. In Tower of Skulls, historian Richard Frank noted that industrial companies, including Ford and General Motors, received early guidance to prepare for wartime production conversion. This began a transformation that would turn America into what Roosevelt would later call the arsenal of democracy. Industrial firms began preparing to switch their production lines from consumer goods to weapons, vehicles, and other military equipment. Civil defense measures were put in place in major cities. This included blackout drills that tested whether residents could quickly turn off all outside lighting when ordered to do so. Frank documented that coastal cities began nightly blackout drills within days of the attack, preparing for air raids that might come at any moment. The draft expansion that followed December 7th changed American society more rapidly than any previous buildup in the nation's history. The response from ordinary Americans was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands of young men volunteered on December 8th alone. They formed long lines at recruitment centers across the country that stretched around blocks. Patriotic feelings mixed with anger over the attack. Lines formed outside recruitment offices before they opened. Many centers stayed open late into the night to handle the volume of applicants who wanted to serve their country. Frank recorded that the U.S. Army added 100,000 new recruits within the first week after the attack due to volunteer surges. Draft boards extended their operating hours. They began calling up men who had previously received deferments. Recruitment posters began circulating nationally within days. They used imagery and language designed to appeal to patriotic sentiment and the desire to respond to the attack on Pearl Harbor. The scale of this buildup was the first of its kind in American history, making it clear that millions of Americans would serve in uniform before the war ended, and that the nation's entire way of life would be transformed by the mobilization. As recruitment surged, defensive preparations intensified along the vulnerable West Coast. Security measures grew stronger as military commanders tried to prepare for possible attacks on the mainland. Naval patrols increased along shipping lanes used by merchant vessels. Destroyers and patrol craft escorted convoys and searched for submarines. Air raid wardens were appointed across California and Oregon. These volunteers received basic training in how to enforce blackout rules and assist during emergencies. Commercial radio stations tested emergency broadcast protocols that would be used if attacks occurred. Newspapers published instructions telling civilians what to do if they heard air raid sirens or saw enemy aircraft. The scale of Japan's offensive soon became clear, revealing that Pearl Harbor was only one piece of a larger plan. In A World at Arms, historian Gerhard Weinberg observed that Japan attacked the Philippines, Guam, Hong Kong, and Malaya within 24 hours, proving Pearl Harbor was part of a coordinated campaign. This planned offensive meant that Allied forces faced threats across a huge geographic area stretching from the Central Pacific to Southeast Asia. Britain and Commonwealth allies immediately aligned themselves with the United States. They formed a formal alliance that would shape military strategy throughout the war. Germany and Italy declared war on the United States on December 11, 1941, 4 days after Pearl Harbor, and this decision brought a two-front war that would test America's capacity like never before. Weinberg noted that Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S. on December 11, 1941, linking the Pacific conflict to the European War. This forced American military leaders to decide how to divide forces between the Pacific and European theaters. They had to balance the need to respond to Japan with the obligation to support Britain against Germany. This war question would dominate planning for months as resources were divided up and priorities established. The decision to focus on defeating Germany first appeared from these early discussions. Defensive operations would continue in the Pacific. This decision shaped the course of the war. However, historians note that this strategy was argued about and debated throughout the conflict. The transformation extended beyond military planning to fundamentally reshape American society. The impacts of Pearl Harbor extended far beyond the immediate military consequences and reshaped the nation in ways that would persist for generations, with American isolationism ending with the attack and the political coalition that had opposed involvement in foreign wars collapsing almost overnight as public opinion shifted dramatically in favor of military action. Weinberg emphasized that these events marked the official end of U.S. isolationism and the beginning of a fully global military commitment. Public opinion shifted in favor of military action. Polls showed support for war that would have been unlikely just days earlier. This shift allowed the government to gather resources and put in place policies that would have faced significant opposition before the attack. It built a national agreement around winning the war that went beyond partisan divisions. The physical transformation of American power proceeded with remarkable speed. The rebuilding of the American military proceeded at a pace that surprised many observers, with new ships constructed in months rather than years, as shipyards operated around the clock with multiple shifts of workers who understood that their work could mean the difference between victory and defeat. Aircraft production increased as factories converted to wartime manufacturing and new facilities were built across the country. Army divisions that existed only on paper in December 1941 were equipped and trained by mid-1942, standing ready for deployment to combat zones where they would prove that American industrial power could be transformed into military might faster than anyone had thought possible. This expansion turned the United States from a relatively small military power into a major force in both the Pacific and Atlantic theaters. Emergency planning and military readiness strategies evolved from lessons learned at Pearl Harbor, and these changes built systems that remain in place today. The organizational failures that had contributed to the disaster led to significant reforms. The importance of intelligence sharing between services led to reforms that eventually brought together intelligence organizations into more combined groups, though these changes took years to fully put in place as different agencies worked to overcome decades of institutional separation. Radar technology became standard equipment across all military branches. Operators received more extensive training in reading contacts and distinguishing between friendly and hostile aircraft. Civil defense systems that had been neglected during peacetime were rebuilt and expanded, with procedures for responding to attacks on American territory developed and regularly practiced in communities across the nation. Perhaps most significantly, the attack on Pearl Harbor marked the beginning of America's permanent engagement with global affairs. The country that had tried to avoid foreign entanglements in the 1930s would emerge from the war with military bases and commitments around the world as the shift from isolationism to global engagement happened quickly, and Pearl Harbor served as the spark that opened this change and made it acceptable to many Americans who had previously opposed any involvement in foreign conflicts. For those who lived through December 7th and the days that followed, the memory stayed vivid for the rest of their lives, with the shock, the confusion, the fear, and the determination to respond all merging into a defining moment that shaped how an entire generation understood their country and their place in history. In the end, the hours immediately after the attack tested America in ways that revealed both organizational weaknesses and the capacity to respond. The decisions during that brief period set the nation on a course that would determine the outcome of the war and shape the world for decades to come. Section 6. Intelligence Failures and Vulnerabilities. The story that unfolded next would test whether America's rapid buildup could match the scale of the challenge it faced. But understanding what happened after Pearl Harbor requires understanding why America had been so vulnerable in the first place. And the answer to that question would reveal failures that went back years. The roots of America's vulnerability lay in decisions made long before December 7, 1941. The United States had spent years trying to avoid involvement in the wars spreading across Europe and Asia. Groups that wanted America to stay isolated, such as America First, grew increasingly powerful during the late 1930s. They argued that American resources should be used at home rather than abroad. This political pressure shaped military policy throughout the decade. Congress was hesitant to expand the military quickly, despite warnings from some officers and officials that war might be coming. The Great Depression had strained the nation's finances. Many representatives believed that spending money on programs at home should take priority over military expansion. In his book, A World at Arms, historian Gerhard Weinberg observed that the U.S. Army in 1941 had only begun modernizing after years of low funding and minimal public support. When the attack on Pearl Harbor occurred, the American military was smaller and less prepared than the situation required. The defensive posture at Pearl Harbor itself reflected these broader problems. The Pacific Fleet had only moved to Pearl Harbor in 1940 as a show of American naval power in the Pacific. Many of the aircraft stationed at Oahu's various airfields were parked wingtip to wingtip in an arrangement designed to prevent sabotage by making the planes easier to guard. However, this arrangement also left them open to air attack, with a single bomb or strafing run capable of damaging multiple aircraft at once, turning what seemed like a defensive measure into a critical vulnerability that would cost American forces dearly. The way American intelligence services were organized created even more serious problems for understanding Japanese intentions. Intelligence gathering in 1941 was split among the Army, the Navy, and the State Department. These organizations did not share information well. Each service collected its own intelligence and looked at it separately. This meant that pieces of information that might have revealed Japanese intentions stayed scattered across different agencies, with no one able to put them together into a clear warning that could have alerted commanders to the approaching danger. In her book, Pearl Harbor, Warning and Decision, historian Roberta Wohlstetter explained that U.S. intelligence was overwhelmed by noise, with thousands of intercepted messages with no context. She further noted that important Japanese signals were lost among routine diplomatic and military traffic. According to Wohlstetter, Army and Navy intelligence did not share raw data consistently, causing gaps in assessment. This organizational structure allowed Japanese preparations to proceed without being detected by the very systems designed to prevent exactly this kind of surprise attack. Even the technology meant to provide early warning had limitations. Radar coverage around Oahu consisted of only 6 mobile stations. All of them were operated by soldiers who had received limited training. When radar operators detected the incoming Japanese aircraft on the morning of December 7, 1941, they reported the contact. They were told not to worry about it because American bombers were expected to arrive from the mainland that morning. These organizational weaknesses and defensive mistakes created the conditions for Japan's attack, but the decision to launch that attack came from a different set of pressures entirely. Japan faced its own set of constraints that pushed it toward war. Japan's choice to strike Pearl Harbor was based on economic and military calculations that Japanese leaders believed offered no alternative, with the country depending heavily on imported oil and the majority of its supply coming from the United States before trade restrictions were put in place. When the American government cut off oil exports to Japan in response to Japanese expansion in China and Southeast Asia, Japanese military leaders faced a critical shortage that threatened their entire war effort. Japanese planners believed that attacking Pearl Harbor would damage the American Pacific Fleet and provide time to secure oil supplies in Southeast Asia from British and Dutch colonies before the United States could recover and strike back. The attack on Hawaii was only one part of a broader offensive. To support this strategy, Japan launched attacks at the same time on Malaya, the Philippines, Guam, and Hong Kong. Weinberg noted that Japan had already planned multiple simultaneous attacks across the Pacific, meaning U.S. defenses were thinly spread. Japanese military leaders imposed radio silence on their fleet to prevent Allied intelligence from detecting their movements, a safety step that proved successful as American forces had no warning of the approaching strike force that would change the course of history. The global situation in 1941 made Japan's calculations more complex and America's defensive challenges even greater. International conditions added layers of complexity to an already difficult situation, with Germany controlling most of Western Europe while Britain fought for survival, the Soviet Union having recently been invaded by Germany, and China having been at war with Japan since 1937. Weinberg emphasized that the global situation, with Germany in the west and Japan in the east, left the U.S. strategically pressured on two fronts, making it nearly impossible to prepare well for threats from multiple directions. Key decision-makers in Washington faced difficult choices with incomplete information. The political constraints shaped how leaders could prepare for war. President Roosevelt understood that war was likely, but also knew that public opinion was strongly against involvement in foreign conflicts, which meant he needed to balance the need to prepare for war with the political reality that moving too aggressively might cost him support in Congress and among voters. Admiral Husband Kimmel and General Walter Short, who commanded forces in Hawaii, both received warnings about possible threats, but interpreted these warnings based on what they believed were the most likely scenarios, which did not include a carrier strike against Pearl Harbor. Allied intelligence services as a whole struggled with the same problem. They knew Japan might take aggressive action, but had trouble determining where and when such action might occur, with some believing Japan would strike British and Dutch possessions in Southeast Asia, but would avoid attacking American territory directly because such an attack would almost certainly bring the United States into the war. Historians continue to debate whether better intelligence sharing or different assumptions could have provided adequate warning. Regardless of what might have been, these problems allowed the attack on Pearl Harbor to succeed, with the decisions in Washington, the organizational issues in intelligence services, and the weaknesses at Pearl Harbor all combining to produce one of the most significant defeats in American military history. But understanding what happened after Pearl Harbor raises an even bigger question. Why did Japan launch this attack in the first place? The decision was not made lightly, and the reasons go far deeper than most people realize. To understand what drove Japan to this moment, we've covered the strategic pressures behind the attack. And if you're curious how Japan's military fortunes shifted just 6 months later, the Battle of Midway tells that story.